Okay. And then saving best two for last, we get to the penultimate one, Invasion from Laser Books, written under the pen name Aaron Wolfe. Hold on, it's hard to get this quite right in here. Which was, I'll get to that, but Dean Koontz rewrote this under the name Winter Moon in the mid 90s because he wanted to update it. Let's see what I got here, though. This is personally my favorite, I guess, of all the early Dean Koontz sci-fi I've been looking at. As besides Beast Child, I suppose. Chapter 4 in Sudden Fear by Bill Munster has a really useful section where it goes into detail over the phenomenon in the 1980s, where there were book collectors who were really suspicious that this book was actually ghostwritten by Stephen King. It's probably because there's several reasons, but the protagonist is named Don Hanlon, similar to Mike Hanlon from the later book It. But all of those plot points are entirely coincidence, so I'm not going to excerpt any of that chapter right now. I'm not going to read any of it. The best thing about this book, I'd say that while I kept thinking like this book was written way too fast while I was reading it, yet but not in a bad way. It just felt like it was written in a hurry, like even in the prose. But then at the end, you find out the whole book itself is supposed to be written as metafiction by the main character. Don, he's forced to write it by these aliens after they kill his wife, and they want humanity. They want human strained behavior explained, and they let him go with an apology after reading his memoirs. This book. So that's kind of cool. I thought that was different. The rewrite of Invasion, titled Winter Moon, came out in 1995, published by Berkeley. I thought the rewrite. I read it too. The rewritten version loses the intense tone. I don't know why he rewrote it and just didn't publish it as is. Maybe because the hero is a Vietnam vet, which wouldn't have been relevant anymore in the 90s. The whole first half of Winter Moon was kind of just Koontz ranting about how immoral Hollywood is. And I was like, well, yeah, duh, but it seemed kind of like, I was like, move on, Dean. But ironically, in a minute here, I'm going to quote Koontz on his objection into politics being, interjected into the first movie made out of his book, Demon Seed. But I'll get to that. I thought the only good part of this rewrite that I really enjoyed was the extra new viewpoint of an old Mexican widower who owned the house before the main characters did, where the house that's being attacked by aliens. And he's the first to notice there's something happening in the forest there in Maine. I thought it was really moving when his wife's corpse, which is buried nearby on his ranch, is reanimated, and it's too horrible for him to see, the alien with its tendrils up inside of, his deceased wife, and he can't imagine how horrible it is to see her violated, that way made a puppet, and it kills him of like a, heart attack or brain aneurysm. Instantly, he's so horrified. That was surprisingly sad. I thought that was good. There's a long section on the history of this book from Catherine Ramsland's biography, so I'm going to read an excerpt from that, page 200 to 201 here. Here we go. Although Dean had decided against writing any more science fiction, his friend Barry Malzberg asked him for a story for Laser Books. Laser was a small line, an attempt by Harlequin to branch out into science fiction. Malzberg had contracted with Laser Books to edit a series of 5 first novels. When one writer failed to deliver, Malzberg turned to Dean. Dean agreed to finish a book that he'd abandoned 3/4 of the way through, but only on the condition that it be published under a pseudonym. He chose the name Aaron Wolfe, and his preferred title was Cold Terror, but that was later changed to Invasion. In the same year this book was published, the last American troops were pulled out of Vietnam, the National Guardsmen were exonerated in the Kent State killings, and there were 2 assassination attempts on President Ford. In an introduction, the editor, Malzberg, presented Invasion as this Aaron Wolfe's first novel. He gave the fictional author an equally fictional history. He was 34, while Dean was 30, successful in another artistic field, married with one child, while Koontz was childless, and lived in the Midwestern United States. Malmsberg offered a list of magazines for checking out Wolfe's short fiction and honored him with a writing fellowship. He is also quoted as saying that Invasion is, quote, one of the most remarkable first novels in any field I've ever read, end quote. In it, the protagonist, Don Hanlon, holds up with his wife, Connie, their 10-year-old son, Toby, on an isolated farm in Maine to rebuild their sense of family. Don had served in Vietnam and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. One day, he and Toby find strange tracks in the snow. One of the horses is killed, and the electricity and phones fail, so Don trudges through a blizzard to a neighboring farm. There he discovers that the people and animals are dead, stripped of flesh. While he's gone, the aliens attack his family. Don returns and uses fire to ward them off, but they kill his wife and abduct his son. Then they send Toby back to act as a communication medium. They want Don to write about his experiences so they can better understand his perceptions of the encounter and the meaning of his actions, which to them seem inexplicable. The report he writes in 3 days is the novel Invasion. The difference between this story and those that Dean had read as a kid was that, contrary to the popular themes, these aliens recognized but failed to appreciate the intelligence in another species. There was no hope for working together, learning from each other, or creating a synthesis that might have positive repercussions for both. This was the mindset of the Vietnam War days, that alien cultures did not get along. The parallels are spelled out in the novel with explicit references to the war. The alien invasion in northern Maine is similar to the United States entering Southeast Asia. They're both part of a madhouse universe. People clash senselessly and kill first before trying to understand, as seemed to be in the case in My Lai. Murder is easier than using reason, but when violence is used as a primary resource and first response, there will be no hope for a peaceful future, regardless of any technological progress. We are as flawed as the universe itself, all of us mad. The only meaning is to be found is random, a quote, of lunatics planning. We have to adapt to the best we can. Years later, in the early 80s, book collectors began to wonder who Aaron Wolfe really might be. Several speculated that, in view of how it seemed to anticipate elements of The Shining, published years later, the isolated snowbound house, supernatural events, a traumatized and perhaps unbalanced father who's also a writer, a vulnerable young son and wife, and people thought that the real author must be Stephen King. It was even as listed as such in some catalogs, and many collectors stocked up in the hope of making a big killing one day on resale. Michael Collins, an expert on King, wrote an article indicating how Invasion reads like an early King novel. But then, in 1984, a book dealer, Bob Weinberg from Oak Forest, Illinois, was in Washington, D.C. researching copyrights in the Library of Congress. He decided to investigate Aaron Wolfe. To his surprise, Dean was credited with the Aaron Wolfe title. Weinberg had met Dean in Tucson, Arizona at the World Fantasy Convention and had benefited from Dean's advice on a novel he'd written. Quote, he went out of his way again and again to help people, Weinberg said. He decided to call Dean up, and Dean confirmed it was him. I asked, Weinberg said, if he minded if I revealed it, and he said, I don't care. So I said, how about if we do a contest? I'll say that we found out who Aaron Wolfe really is, and he's a really well-known horror writer whose last name begins with K. 200 people wrote in, and only 15 of them said they thought it was Koontz. So Dean got a kick out of the whole thing, end quote. Dean supplied 5 signed copies of this book to offer as prizes to those he guessed correctly. And that's the end of the excerpt from Ramsden there. So anyway, one of the best ones of all, if you can find the original, I'd say definitely buy it. Really fun novel. Easily read in a day, all in one sitting. The aliens are pretty scary for a brief minute. They don't understand what death is, so they kill and maim creatures and humans terribly, simply because they don't understand why they don't wake up. The aliens themselves remorph, are immortal and don't understand what death is, and this makes them terrible monsters, whether they're aware of it or not. And it's only after they're explained to why they're monsters. Again, maybe a reference to Koontz's father, and his dealing with his psychopathy and so forth, which keeps coming up. Okay, up next we have the last one, Demon Seed.